Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to start the webinar, and I would like to say right off the bat that there is an interpretation service, French to English, English to French, if you would like. If you'd like to activate it, you can do it by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen.
Donc, hello everyone. I have the pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. Simultaneous French and English translation is provided. If you want to activate the service, you may click on the planet icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen. There's also ASL and LSQ services provided, as you can see on the screen.
I'm going to continue in French from now on, and so you can see that we have LSQ and ASL interpretation on the screen as well. We are already recording this webinar to make it accessible after, so that people can listen to it after the fact. So now that we've gone over those few details, I'd like to wish you welcome in the name of CREMIS, and this is an event that we're doing jointly with the NRHN and with the federal advocate for housing. So we're going to look at alternative citizen practices. So we're in an assistance environment and the social services at the CISSS in Quebec. Our research program goes into social inequality issues and especially into homelessness, and we have several researchers that we're going to hear from in a few moments. So last housekeeping note before turning it over to Sue-Anne. For people who wish to ask questions or to share any comments, we have the Q&A function that you can use throughout this event, and the research team will be able to answer you or see your questions and comments, and they can answer them in due time. So without further ado, I wish you a good webinar, and I'll leave it over to Sue-Anne.
On behalf of the team today, we wish to acknowledge that the laws and policies in our report, which will be available soon, are grounded in the colonial, legal, and political structures forcibly overlaid on the pre-existing Indigenous systems of law and governance of these places. These structures have been and continue to be instruments of dispossession, violence, and disconnection from territory, place, culture, community, and family. Housing precarity and homelessness are intertwined with this colonial reality, and the overlap of federal, provincial, and municipal jurisdictions and the attempted erasure of Indigenous jurisdiction is starkly evident in some of our findings. In our view, Indigenous systems of law and governance must be central to any meaningful attempt to address homelessness and realize the right to housing. We just wanted to say that from the outset. Today's speakers, we have the entire research team here. J'ai vraiment le grand honneur de travailler avec des personnes exceptionnelles dans le cadre de ce projet qui sommes ici aujourd'hui. Alexandra Flynn of the University of British Columbia, Joe Hermer from University of Toronto, Caroline Leblanc de l'Université de Sherbrooke, Caitlin Schwan from the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, Esther Van Wagner from York University. Et nous sommes très honorés d'accueillir Madame Marie-Josée Hull, notre première défenseure fédérale des logements, and Kim Hines, founder of the Lived Experience of Homelessness Network. Thank you very much for being with us today. I'm trying to speak slowly. This is very difficult for me as I tend to talk very quickly. We also, before I pass over the mic to Madame Hull, we also want to acknowledge the invaluable contributions of many people to this project, including Laurie Bacro, Sydney Chapados, Sam Freeman, Pedram Golipoul, Palmira Lutoto, Neil McIsaac, Isabelle Rafestin, Emily Roberge, and Emma Smith, as well as the many peer and people with lived experience and community organizations that contribute to this project. Marie-Josée Hull, who is the federal housing advocate and is appointed to promote and protect the right to housing in Canada. Thank you for being with us today, Madame Hull.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. First of all, I want to say, whenever I hear Madame Hull, I'm like that's my grandmother, right? So anyone can feel welcome to call me Marie-Josée, and I grew up in Alberta, so MJ also works, or Marie. But, you know, having said that, I do want to say that it is my absolute pleasure to join you all today and provide some introductory remarks for this really important conversation about homeless encampments. My remarks will be delivered in both English and French, so I encourage you to be ready to use the simultaneous translation services provided as needed.
I would like to recognize the privilege of speaking to you from the unceded ancestral lands of the Algonquin-Anishinaabe Nation, known as Colonial Ottawa. As this is a virtual event, I also want to acknowledge the ancestral territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples of this country. This commitment is something that we are trying to build with Aboriginal peoples based on mutual respect, peace, and reconciliation. And saying this, I am also fully conscious, aware of the failure of successive governments and the Canadian people to honor past commitments. We must earn the trust of Aboriginal peoples through our actions. The housing and homelessness crisis in Canada, including the disproportionate number of Aboriginal people living in encampments, reminds us of the impact of our failures and shows us how far we have to go to meet our obligations.
I will now switch to English. Je vais continuer en anglais. I'm here today in my role as the federal housing advocate, but first and foremost, I'm here as a person who has experienced poverty, displacement, geographic marginalization, and housing precarity. I assumed my new role in February of this year, and my mandate is independent of government and nonpartisan. And I act as Canada's watchdog for the right to adequate housing and try to ensure that housing conversations focus on human rights. And I do this by amplifying the voices of people experiencing inadequate housing and homelessness and holding governments accountable and making recommendations to improve housing-related laws, programs, and policies. And it's important to recognize that the advocate is not a recourse mechanism for individual complaints. The Act makes it clear that my role is to focus on systemic housing issues influencing legislation, policies, and programs. So these systemic issues are identified by submissions coming from organizations or the public through my engagement with Indigenous communities, people with lived experience, and as a result of research and studies. In the case of encampments, I adopted this issue as a priority in large part because of the research we'll be hearing about today. And I have since had the chance to meet with encampment residents in British Columbia, and we've started to receive submissions regarding encampments as a systemic housing issue. Encampments are one of the most visible signs of our current housing crisis and among the most egregious examples of failures of government to implement the right to adequate housing in Canada with permanent housing solutions. And they're not a new phenomenon in Canada, but the situation has been made worse by the pandemic and the current economic downturn. So economics have disproportionate levels of residents who are First Nation, Inuit, or Métis that lack social support to maintain housing in towns or cities, or often report having to flee violence or do not have adequate housing if they're from an Indigenous community. And too many people in Canada have little choice but to turn to living in tents or informal shelters to survive. Too many people have been harmed and died as a result of exposure, fire, overdose, and other threats to life and safety. And residents also face harassment and violence from state and non-state actors. And while these conditions amount to serious violations of fundamental human rights, including the right to housing, they also need to be seen as human rights claims. And despite their existence in Canada for so many years, encampments receive little attention from authorities until recently. And sadly, when encampments make the news, it's mostly because encampment residents are facing forced evictions. So fortunately, there's more awareness and understanding today thanks to the fantastic efforts by lived experts and countless advocates across the country. And the research presented today adds to the recent Auditor General's report and a growing body of evidence to demonstrate that current approaches to homelessness, they are not working. The research we're about to hear about is an important contribution to changing the discourse, an important contribution to recognizing the human rights of encampment residents. And these research findings will guide my efforts as advocate for approaches to encampments rooted in the principles of human rights. My office has been privileged to work with the Université de Montréal, who convened a research team that included lived expertise, scholars, advocates, and activists from communities across Canada. And many of these researchers are here with us today, and I want to take this opportunity to thank them for their incredible work highlighting the human rights dimension of encampments.
Above all, people living in settlements and their advocates have called for an adequate supply of safe, adequate and secure housing. A critical human rights issue in the settlements is the provision of essential services. The main human rights violation identified by the research product are policing and law enforcement actions targeting people living in these encampments. Many municipal governments in Canada have systematically chosen to issue tickets, eviction notices, to remove and destroy tents and equipment, rather than upholding the rights of people living in encampments, their right to safety, security, and human dignity. The research also shows that people living in encampments were subjected to dangerous evictions and forced displacement. In fact, evictions from encampments often compromise safety, as these people often find themselves in even more precarious and dangerous situations thereafter. To realize the right to housing, it is essential that people experiencing homelessness be meaningfully involved in the design and implementation of policies, programs, and practices. According to the research, people living in encampments are often perceived by the media as non-citizens and as a nuisance to public safety and the public space. They are treated as such by the public and by policymakers. So all levels of government must work together to plan and take concrete actions to ensure that the housing rights of people living in encampments are respected. The federal government in particular has a duty to show leadership in this area and to ensure that municipalities have the resources they need to fulfill their human rights obligations.
As I plan my future work to promote and protect the human rights of encampment residents, I will be guided by the research findings as well as the excellent work of The Shift and the Foundational National Protocol for Homeless Encampments in Canada, written by Leilani Farha and Farha Schwan. And I will be guided and inspired by what I learned from Indigenous residents and lived experts. In August, I visited Victoria, Prince George, and Vancouver and listened to some of the residents living in encampments that feature in the case studies we'll be hearing about today. And while in BC, I heard that many people choose to live outside because the alternatives are inadequate. And I was impressed by the depth of knowledge and capacity of the residents. This experience convinced me that a big part of my role is to help remove the systemic barriers which get in the way of people experiencing homelessness from helping themselves. And my office is working with The Shift on a project to continue this direct engagement with encampment residents in 4 municipalities across the country. I started to share my concerns with a number of municipal leaders and intend to engage with the Big City Mayors Caucus and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And my office will be organizing meetings with the federal level with Reaching Home and other relevant government departments such as CERNA and IST to share these research findings and explore how the federal government can help ensure a human rights-based approach to encampments. Provincial and territorial governments also need to be part of the solution, and I really look forward to finding opportunities to engage with them in this work. I'll also engage national Indigenous organizations and Indigenous-led housing organizations. The human rights of encampment residents will remain one of my top priorities, and I intend to mobilize my powers to review these gross violations of the right to adequate housing, which have persisted for far too long in communities across this country. By the end of the year, I expect to be in a position to deliver recommendations to the federal government and to advise provinces, territories, and municipalities about the actions required to fulfill their human rights obligation when it comes to encampment residents. And we can and we must do better to ensure that everyone enjoys the right to live in peace, security, and in dignity. And as you listen to the researchers today, I hope you'll be thinking about the role you can play to ensure a human rights-based approach to ending homelessness. I know I will be. So thank you so much. Merci, miigwech.
Thank you so much for your leadership and your engagement on many, many files, but particularly this file. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move along to briefly just set a bit the context before we get into more of the results. We had a very quick turnaround on this project. The main research objective was really to provide the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate with relevant knowledge to examine the human rights dimensions on encampments across Canada. And in order to do so, we mobilized very quickly some research that was already taking place in the interest of time and in the interest of impact. But broadly speaking, there were 4 complementary objectives: to produce a literature review on the human rights dimensions of encampments, a media scan of recent stories about encampments since the pandemic began, because we know that there has been an increase also in the numbers of people experiencing homelessness since the pandemic, combined with the housing crisis. And we wanted to produce also a few case studies to zoom in on local responses and expose the regulation of encampments and the violation of human rights. And lastly, a policy scan on laws affecting encampments across Canada. So today, we're going to provide in 3 separate 10-minute chunks 3 provincial perspectives on the regulation of encampments. I'll hand it right over to Joe and Kim, who are our first presenters today. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. It really is a privilege to be part of this today, and along with Kim Hines in Victoria. Hi, Kim. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, Joe?
So I'm really keen to hear some of your thoughts on what's going on. But first, let me just make a couple of brief comments about the 2 British Columbia case studies. The first one in Vancouver in Crab Park, one of the main takeaways from the Crab Park case study done by our colleague here, Alexandra Flynn, is that all levels of government have a role to play in ensuring human rights in encampments. And this includes the charter rights of encampment residents. Governments cannot simply act like private property owners and legally or morally positioned unhoused people as trespassers or squatters and then move in an attempt to evict them or carry out prejudicial policing strategies. And this is particularly clear in Alex's case study. Crab Park, first and foremost, is on unceded Indigenous territory and is still owned under Canadian law, not by the City of Vancouver, but by the federal government itself. Turning to Prince George, I concluded in my study that the city has carried out gross violations of the principles embedded in human rights law, primarily in terms of the unlawful destruction of residents' shelters and belongings last November 17th, but also by the continued treatment of encampment residents and the use of the Safe Streets bylaw. And, it's important to note that last March, the city did actually apologize for the Moccasin Flats demolition, specifically admitting fault in the harm that the city caused to vulnerable people in their policing action. And, as time goes on since then, I really regret to say this apology really seems to look like a cynical public relations move. The city of Prince George continues to have a colonial fort-like mentality on this issue and continues to show a strong level of contempt for unhoused people in public space, the majority of whom are Indigenous. Prince George has a new mayor, Simon Yu, and he has suggested, I think he has, that he's open to something like a human rights approach. He has talked about the importance of inclusion and diversity and community compassion and response. And I think for him to have any credibility on this issue going forward, he will need to immediately put a resolution forward to the Prince George Council to repeal the Safe Streets bylaw. This would be, I think, the very minimum he could do to start a conversation with encampment residents in good faith and build a relationship with them, something the city so far has had almost no interest in doing. So simply put, I think the city really has to move from this crazy tunnel vision that seems to have captured the city leadership, being that they can somehow police their way out of this issue, despite all the evidence that this is the very worst approach that they could take. So Kim, just turning to Kim and maybe building on that a bit, we've talked a lot the last couple of years really about what's going on in Victoria and Prince George and other places. And we talked about a story a couple of weeks ago around a park in Victoria. You want to talk about a bit of the experience with bylaw there?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm honored to be here, and I'm currently in the Lekwungen Wasanic territory, Lekwungen speaking Wasanic territory, Songhees. And I'm a settler Acadian, uninvited guest in the territory, and really trying to stay grounded by keeping in mind the Indigenous people who I know who are in my life, and I'm thinking of them to help stay real. So what's happened is I went in one day to Stadacona Park, which is an encampment, trying to be an encampment, and a young man basically said that the bylaw came, and every day they come, I guess. Some days they don't, it's a relief, but most days they do. And they come and they make them move, they displace them. They have to pack up and they move 6 feet. These are the people trying to be together for safety. And they're constantly under attack of displacement, forced displacement. And he said, why do I have to move every day 6 feet in the cold? Right now, he said something like it makes his mental health, struggle. And the bylaw officer actually said, because you are entrenched. So it just kind of struck me, and I came home and I looked up entrenched, and it's about war. So it's like the bylaw are seeing human people as oppositional force that they have to go out and move. And it's just upsetting. I just found it very fascinating that they use that terminology. And there are a couple other parks too, just to remind people, like Topaz, where people are trying to be in encampments, but it's like the police state apparatus are not allowing it. And I must bring up that they have infiltrated outreach. It's very difficult for outreach workers. It's very difficult for BC housing workers. It's very difficult for all of them to do their jobs. And for community to even go and be with them has been a bit of a battle. And you spoke about this. I'm a peer, I'm lived experience. A lot of people are, and there's a lot of Indigenous community in our Leon community. And so we are trying to give them the support predominantly right now, because it's really clear that like there's a real issue around social stigma and social inequality. You know what I mean? And it's like it's affecting their lives every day, and it affects our mental health of people who are housed. Like this isn't just affecting the unhoused. It's the worst case scenario that's right out there. And it's a bit, I don't know how to explain, like the words sometimes are hard to find. It's disconcerting how much there's like a battle between social inequality and social stigma. Or do you know what I mean? Like there's a battle between social equality, and this thing with social stigma. And I've been feeling, and maybe it's radical, I don't know, but I've been feeling like, and I've been witnessing that the police are leading, like the police state apparatus, that's bylaw police, private security. And I want to say thank you to the private security who are not acting like police. But predominantly they seem to lead in social stigma, and it really affects the people who are in the encampments, and it's starting to affect the people who are trying to be in the community still. So we now, have to go out in pairs in concern about attacks, that kind of thing. So you're out there trying to help the unhoused who are displaced every day. And one other point I want to make is consistently right now, the bylaw keeps saying to the unhoused, when they say why, they say, talk to BC Housing. Like, why are you coming here every 15 minutes driving here to our shelter? Talk to BC Housing. They contracted us for that. When you ask them about this stuff right now, I've noticed in the downtown east side, when they do violence there, the police are saying, talk to the NDP leader. It's like they're doing all these things, and they're saying that you got to talk to those people because they have the power. But really, I don't see that our elected officials have the power in the municipalities, to sort of say, to bylaw, can you back off? Or to police, can you back off? Can we allow the peer workers in, please, with all due respect? Like it's like anyways. Oh, that's our timer there. We got 1 minute. We got 1 minute.
One of the other meetings that entrenched I think we're up to a minute. We have a minute left. Well, but one of the almost second meetings of entrenched, which goes along, has to do with moving 6 feet, moving 10 feet, moving around out of sight. So the second meaning is that there's really the person has no place at all in public space. They're a non-citizen. They don't hold any sort of rights. And no matter what they do, their existence through a network of bylaw fences, often their existence is actually outlawed in public space. So it seems to have that dual meaning of adversary and expulsion at the same time. Is that right, do you think?
Well, yeah, and look at how many people are being, so they like people are having mental health breakdowns. I mean, I'm working with all the skills I have for mine. Most people I know, we have a home, we have the ability to do particular basic things to care, but our unhoused don't. It's affecting our mental health as well. Do you know what I mean? And in that, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but I think, can you ask the question again? But you know what I mean? It's like the police are not the answer. They're not the solution. And how do we empower the municipal, how do we, I don't know, like I'm looking forward to hearing from other people here, because the police are not just saying you have to move, they're shooting people. We've had killings in the downtown east side on Hastings. After that man was shot with the beanbag shotgun and died because he had, accidental pepper spray in his eye or whatever, and he was trying to get milk on his eyes. And everybody around was telling the police he's okay, and they shot him with the pepper bag, the beanbag. He's dead. That's a travesty, man. And then the next day here in Victoria, one of the brothers who was removed from Stadacona Park was up by Uptown Mall. And thank you to Louise Dixon, Times Colonist, for reporting this in a respectful way and putting our alarms to it. But the police displaced him at 12:30 in the morning. And very upsetting to hear about this. And he ended up running, and they shot him with the beanbag shotguns. And he went to jail for the weekend, and his dogs were taken to bylaw and or in the pound, and they still have his dogs. So that's really distressing to people. So, we need the support and money to go to counseling, support, peer support, being able to be in the public with our human fellow people, you know. Yeah, we need support to get to do that.
Thanks so much, Kim.
Thanks
You're
so
welcome.
much, Kim. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Kim, for also really giving an intimate view of the human consequences. You know, we're not just talking about encampments as physical space, we're talking about the human consequences as well. And we don't have time right now to address this slide that you see before you that's going to rapidly disappear. But just know that in our final report, there's a whole chapter, an excellent chapter here authored by Joe on the impact of municipal bylaws and the regulation of encampments. But you really detailed elements to it, but just to know that there's a chapter and there's a framework there to better understand some of exactly the harassment, the moving along, the displacement, and everything that you mentioned. So I'm going to pass it on to Esther, who's with us, who has 10 minutes to talk to us about from the Ontario case studies. Thank you, Esther. I hope you're there.
Thanks so much. So Toronto and Hamilton are interesting case studies in terms of just illustrating the disconnect between the theory and narratives that governments perpetuate about the right to housing and their practices, and then what they actually do on the ground. The City of Toronto, for example, has expressly adopted an inclusive rights-based approach to housing in their Toronto Housing Charter and their Housing Action Plan. And they've done so expressly to be in compliance with international human rights law and the federal recognition of the right to adequate housing. It's also recognized its obligations under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In fact, it was one of the first government in Canada to do so, specifically recognizing rights of self-determination in relation to social programs, including housing. At the same time, they have acted as if they're not bound by human rights commitments, that these are aspirational. The ongoing reality of encampments in Toronto and Hamilton during the pandemic has demonstrated that these obligations remain unfulfilled, and in fact, councils continue to reject concrete proposals and motions put forward to implement elements of a human rights-based approach. So for example, we've seen in both case studies a consistent lack of support for basic service provision, forced evictions across multiple sites under heavy police presence with police violence at times, all based on the punitive enforcement of bylaws and trespass. Residents' belongings have been destroyed and treated as waste. There have not been consistent offers of permanent adequate housing at eviction sites. Indeed, some have been offered no housing at all, or only inappropriate and unsafe shelter space from which many residents have returned to encampments. Bylaws continue to be enforced in both cities that are clearly inconsistent with the application of a rights-based approach that actively criminalize residents and supporters, including in Toronto, requests for egregious release conditions for those charged at evictions, including a ban of 2 residents from all city parks and community centers for 1 year. In Hamilton, encampments, as in Toronto, were spread across many sites, and while there was an early successful injunction motion that resulted in a negotiated settlement and a bylaw enforcement protocol, even under the protocol, we saw violations, though the amended process for bylaw enforcement under that did provide for some notice and did provide for some exceptions for those who were deemed highly vulnerable under the agreed upon assessment tool. Nonetheless, we saw throughout 2020 and 2021, Hamilton enforced restrictions on the size of encampments. We saw location restrictions enforced against encampments, continuing the cycle of forced displacement. And we heard advocates say that this made it very difficult to continue to sustain relationships and provide support for encampment residents. For the balance of 2020 and early 2021 in Hamilton, this was the status quo, but in the summer of 2021, Hamilton Council repealed the protocol unilaterally with just 3 weeks notice and introduced a 6-step enforcement plan to reinstate their regular bylaw enforcement. In both Toronto and Hamilton, we saw encampment residents and allies, strong civil society networks that had been built up to support those living in encampments, use legal strategies to attempt to enforce their human rights. And if we go to the next slide, the case names are on there. In Toronto, we had a injunction application in Black and City in Toronto, and in Hamilton later on we had the Poff and Hamilton case. Both of these raised charter grounds for protection of the encampment residents' human rights, and both were unsuccessful in obtaining those injunctions, and we have not had a full hearing on the merits. So the attempt to use legal strategies was thus far unsuccessful, despite findings that there was merit to the raising of Section 7, the security of the person arguments, as well as Section 15 equality arguments. So these decisions do not affirm that these bylaws are in fact constitutional, but they determine that the court found on the balance of convenience that the cities were able to continue to exercise their right to govern public space, even when there was a danger of these human rights violations. The courts in Ontario have taken a little bit of a different tack than the courts in BC, and we have really seen an emphasis in Ontario on cities' property rights to govern that public space, and a very strong inclination to accept cities' arguments that the shelters provided are both accessible and adequate, and that the cities have taken the appropriate steps to protect people during COVID. This balance of convenience test has really privileged the evidence of the city and made it very difficult to enforce the rights-based framework, because it's not an easy space in which to recognize encampment residents as rights holders, to provide the context of encampments, including the impacts of colonialism, systemic discrimination in housing and policing, and has really failed to address the lack of meaningful consultation, basic services, and ongoing criminalization of encampment residents and allies.
Thank you, Esther. Wow, you're under time. Good job. I'm sure there'll be questions at the end.
We're continuing now with Caroline. Over to you. Hello, everyone. I'd like to highlight that I'm honored to share this space. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the situation in Quebec. There's Gatineau, Sherbrooke, and Montreal who have been in the media, Granby also. But obviously there are other cities in Quebec and municipalities. If you could just move this up, please, or we're going to get into the community response. So this is to people who don't want to go into refuges, and so the refuges are considered counterproductive to social insertion, because it puts people into a vicious cycle or circle. And so people also wanted to claim their right to housing, and they want to make sure that this right is upheld without any intervention. So people who are living in the encampments want to have three things put in place to ensure security. What we saw within our analysis is that several people have mobilized to deal with these safety issues. Inspectors, there's issues with fires, and so we want to make sure that there's water on site to deal with this as well. The Facebook page targets their needs, but also to avoid surpluses. They want a few different things with overdoses, for instance, in our analysis. And we also understood that several people wanted to mobilize to claim and to denounce and do protests, specifically one specific dismantling of an encampment. And so these encampments can be a way of claiming one's rights, especially with decision makers. So people who cohabitate within these places, they have an important role within the community, and we were able to see a wave of solidarity, a significant one, and also claiming the right to occupy the space. So they said that they weren't a nuisance in their neighborhood, and also we were able to see in the analysis, the media analysis, that certain residents were protesting the presence of the encampments. In terms of the community response, it's important to look at the collective that was created. There are 18 organizations behind this, and they are to uphold people who didn't have any other option than a tent or an encampment to have a roof over their heads. So there's several organizations that are working very closely with these people who are in a situation of homelessness or significant poverty. So according to our analysis of this report, we highlighted that people that got moved into refuges is not a good solution. And so they agree that we need to offer other new resources and innovate to make sure that we're doing the most we can. We also have to denounce the dismantling because of the danger to people's health, and that this should be unacceptable if there's not a very real alternative. In terms of camps versus housing, well, obviously we know that these encampments don't replace other types of housing, but we want to ensure the security, and that's one solution that people will be able to turn towards, and we need to respect this choice and also protect their independence to make this choice. So there's a campaign as well for donations, and it was highly criticized in the media. They also sent out some pamphlets, and so everybody agrees that we need to get rid of all of the waste and get sanitary services, etc., and various services in these encampments. So we can change slides. In terms of the political response, well, we were able to notice in the media articles that there was sort of a distortion between what was happening on the ground and the different and the thought processes of our policymakers. So there's a reduction and a lack of resources. There's also a lack of financing, funding. And so this led to the creation of certain encampments. And the policymakers don't always recognize this impact. I'm able to see that the politicians' response, they have the will to collaborate, and we need to avoid this punitive approach. in order to get rid of the encampments. We also have a certain pressure on residents, which has limited their ability to heat their encampments. And so we want to ask the population to stop providing donations and to in fact help them to go towards refuges, etc. So these decisions that policymakers are often to deal with the safety nuisance and criminality and sort of to deal with overdoses as well. And when encampments become big, well, to supply equipment as well. So there's also environmental issues to deal with relative to this, because some of these encampments are close to bodies of water. So there are safety issues, and we found that this can also be used to camouflage different political issues to do with homelessness. And so when we dismantle these locations, it's an infringement to human rights, and also people often find themselves in difficult safety situations. There's an operation called mise à l'abri, a roof over your head, and there are encampments in Montreal, and to get people to leave them and to go towards refuges by offering to store their personal items. And so they're trying to move people towards these refuges, but they aren't necessarily in a position to host them. And then they go from a temporary situation to another precarious situation. So in terms of homelessness versus dismantling, well, people staying in these encampments, even though the encampments are tolerated, there's always this tolerating doesn't mean that they're accepted by the community. So dismantling can also involve very significant economic costs and also use a lot of community resources. And there's a psychological impact as well in the community, in the homeless community, that can also be felt by the rest of the community. What was interesting in our analysis was that their perception of the operations in connection with dismantling is often distorted in terms of the community perspective. So there's a person, the person responsible for communications at the City of Montreal. They saw people who were really shocked by the violence of the operation, of losing their house, they're getting kicked out of the encampment, and it's like using a bazooka to kill a fly. So they didn't feel like the force that was used was really reasonable. During municipal elections, we found that different candidates were using these encampments as a significant issue to show where they stood. And we also know that elected officials often highlight that the inaction on the federal and provincial level in terms of housing is very marked, and that they don't have any power over the housing crisis. But on the opposite side, the government is saying that we have enough housing, and that the spaces in refuges are significant. But this is not at all what we found in terms of our studies in Quebec. And Chantal Rouleau said that this was not directly related to the housing crisis. So to summarize, it's important to understand these issues in terms of rights, because these people have rights, and I invite you to look at the report, which has several recommendations, which are based also on the collective report on not leaving anybody behind. Thank you very much, Caroline. That was excellent.
Caitlin Schwan, it's your turn. Is everything okay on your end, Caitlin?
Oh, can you hear me? Okay, great. Yes, I'm here. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Sue-Ann. I'm here. Hi, so honored to be here. My name is Farha Schwan. I'm an uninvited settler calling in from the traditional territories of the Hopi, Yavapai, and Apache peoples here in Arizona, actually. My colleagues today have really powerfully articulated what encampments force us to grapple with as a society. They really ask us to ask difficult human rights questions. And I think the most vivid one for us is, do we as a society believe people who don't have housing have a right to life? Because that is really what we're talking about today when we're talking about encampments. We're talking about people who are trying to survive in the most dire circumstances and trying to protect their lives. So to add to this discussion, very briefly, I'm going to be talking about the National Protocol on Homeless Encampments. This was drafted by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing and myself in 2020. And the hope with this document is that it would outline legal obligations that governments in Canada have towards people living in encampments. So we're drawing both on domestic law and international human rights law. So it was supposed to be a very a comprehensive statement on what those standards are. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there's 8 principles that we outline. I'd encourage you, just because we don't have much time, to go and look at the document. My colleague is going to post it in the Q&A, a link to this document, but I'm going to go through 3 of these key principles that I think are particularly relevant for our conversation today. Next slide, please. The other thing I wanted to mention before I get started is that we also developed a 2-page document for folks living in encampments on what their human rights are. We worked with advocates and activists and folks living in encampments to develop this. So I'll ask my colleague to also put a link to that in the chat, and feel free to download it and distribute it, print it, photocopy it, share it with folks as a resource as well. So check out both the protocol and the 2-pager, please. Yeah, next slide, please. Thanks. So kind of diving into the principles here, kind of first and foremost, the protocol really realizes that residents of encampments are rights holders. They have a right to housing and a right to life, and governments have obligations to uphold their rights. And Marie-Josée actually spoke to this very beautifully. What human rights law articulates is very nuanced. Encampments are human rights violations because people are forced to rely on them due to government failures, but they're also a human rights claim. They are made in response to violations of the right to housing by people who don't have housing otherwise and have been effectively severely marginalized from society. And they are an expression of people's attempts to claim legitimate space within cities, the right to build a community, to assert claims to land and territories, and a refusal ultimately to be made invisible. And in this way, they are kind of a grassroots form of human rights practice. And what this means for governments, the obligation this imposes on governments, is that they can't respond to encampments from a place of governance, from a focus on city beautification, from a focus on property prices. The response has to come from an understanding that encampments are legitimate homes that people have a right to, even if those homes are on public or private property that they don't own. This is the human rights standards in law. Next slide, please. What is also at the core of this idea of people as rights holders is this idea of meaningful engagement. And that is the idea that people living in homelessness have the right to be involved in the design and implementation of policies, of programs and practices that affect them. So governments often talk about doing consultations, for example, with people living in encampments. But what is important to understand is that in human rights law, the standard is very high when it comes to meaningful engagement. There has to be actual power sharing between governments and people who are living in encampments. So what do I mean by that? What we're talking about is a government can't go into a meeting with encampment residents with a predetermined idea of what is going to come out. Residents have to be able to say no to a proposal without being evicted, without being ticketed, without having their property destroyed. And governments also have to provide people living in encampments with materials that will help them engage in making decisions about policies, practices, programs. So that can be access to transportation, information, time and space to consider what are actually the best options for them. And it's really challenging work. I do not dispute that by any means, but it is really at the heart of recognizing that people living in encampments are experts in their own lives, and that it's government's obligation to engage with them in that way, with an understanding of their agency, an understanding of their capacity to design solutions for themselves. And so you're probably looking at this slide and wondering, what is this image? Very brief story. I met a woman at an encampment in Toronto and spoke with her at some length. And as I was leaving, I asked her, seeing this kind of spooled out measuring tape there, could you tell me about this measuring tape and what function it plays for you, or what the importance is? And she said, yeah, this is my security measure, because I can hear when people step on the measuring tape, it makes a particular kind of crinkle, and it alerts me to the fact that someone is around my tent, and I need to be alert to that for my own safety. So this is an example of like incredible innovation in the midst of lack of resources. And so when we think about human rights and meaningful engagement, we need to be thinking about opportunities to kind of build on the innovation and creativity and skills that are already being exhibited by folks who are living in encampments. Next slide, please. The second principle, and I'll speak to this briefly because many of my colleagues have spoken to evictions here, but just to say, very central to a human rights approach is a prohibition against forced eviction of encampments. So international human rights law doesn't permit governments to destroy people's homes, even if those homes are made of tarp, made of cardboard, made of wood, and even if they're established without legal authority. So the standard is that governments may not remove residents from encampments without meaningfully engaging with them and identifying alternative places to live that are acceptable to them. And if they are removed and there isn't sufficient legal resources provided to encampment residents, this is considered a forced eviction, and it's considered a gross human rights violation. And perhaps I'll skip over a little bit here, but just to say, governments often use language, they often use discretionary bylaws around fire, health, safety in order to justify evictions. But what we've been finding in our research, as my colleagues have spoken to, this is often inconsistent with a harm reduction approach to health and safety. It often doesn't center lived experts' experiences and realities in encampments or engage them meaningfully in developing solutions together. Next slide, please. I also wanted to very briefly mention this. This is something that we did with the protocol and with Pivot Legal Society out in BC, was develop a tool for folks who are living in encampments to actually rate their governments with respect to whether they are affirming their legal and human rights obligations or not. So it's kind of a report card, and it plays on this idea that all of us are very fearful of getting negative report cards, but it also gives the power back to folks who are living in encampments to say, these are my human rights. This is the grade that we are providing to you, the government, about to what extent you are respecting them or not. So I'll also drop a link to this resource as well that might be useful to folks. Next slide, please. And the final human rights principle I wanted to highlight for us is that under human rights law, governments must provide access to basic services such as clean water, sanitation facilities, electricity, and heat within encampments. In most encampments across Canada, access to basic services is quite limited, unpredictable, in some cases entirely absent. And in many cases, we have cities pushing folks out from where they are living by intentionally depriving them of access to water and sanitation and preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid in some cases. So the images you see here are actually a city in BC that shut off water to showers that the community had built for the encampment. So it was, what was quite powerful is encampments took a page from the protocol and printed it out on their right to water and sanitation and printed it on these showers that had the water shut off. And as all of you will know, this stands in stark contrast to what public health officials would say about encampments, but it also violates a number of human rights, including the right to water and sanitation. So I'll stop there, but please look at those resources. I do hope that they are incredibly helpful. The research we've developed should also be helpful to all of you who are working in this area, and sending much gratitude and solidarity to everyone who's working in this area. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Caitlin, for a really impactful expose. Thank you very much. Alex, we're on to you.
Yes, hi everybody. I just want to say at the outset how grateful we are to have all of you here. I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, but I see that so many of you are coming from jurisdictions all across the country, and it's heartening to see that this is a crisis. This is a housing crisis that unhoused people are bearing the brunt of. And our research is essentially acknowledging the extent to which people have been harmed through eviction processes that violate people's human rights, disregard notions of citizenship, and deny access to public space for the most vulnerable people who are experiencing this housing crisis. And, you know, as you heard from my colleagues, these practices do not lead to safer conditions for unhoused people. They are simply placed in increasingly insecure and unsafe situations. We have, you know, municipalities all across the country who are engaged in evictions, with some people within municipal spheres trying to promote different approaches. But in our view, this should not be a municipal by municipal situation. There needs to be leadership, and this leadership needs to come from the federal government. And it needs to come from the federal government because they have enacted a piece of legislation that recognizes the human rights of people to have housing. And this includes people who live in encampments because they do not have any other safe, suitable locations to live. So I'm just going to wrap up our presentation with the recommendations that we provide to the Government of Canada. I mean, you've heard a lot about the enforcement of encampments at the local level, and you've also heard how there's a federal act that recognizes the right to housing. And so what we are trying to do is stitch together these two issues. How can we ensure that this national right is seen all the way down to the municipal sphere? And so we have 5 recommendations for the Government of Canada specifically. And this is premised on the view that the Government of Canada cannot take a back seat to what is going on in encampments. We are very happy that the federal advocate recognizes this And in our view, the government of Canada must recognize this in concrete, clear ways that show that it is committed to the human rights of people who are encampments. So number one, a rights-based approach to encampments requires all governments to end their practices of using trespass orders, bylaws, and policing to evict unhoused people from encampments. So this is a recognition that encampments are survival spaces for unsheltered people and that they are highly policed and regulated through a number of actors, jurisdictions, and authorities. And these authorities are asserting rights to municipal space as though it's private space through trespass orders. In our view, governments must recognize the rights to safety, security, and human dignity by responding to encampments without relying on policing and punitive or exclusionary measures. And we advance that these rights are enshrined in the National Housing Strategy Act, which incorporate international norms of human rights that Caitlin has already spoken about. So in addition to, and we'll offer some suggestions on how to ensure that municipalities abide by these human rights standards, we call on the Government of Canada to practice what it preaches in terms of the legislation where there are encampments on federal lands. So specifically, Crab Park in Vancouver is located on federal lands, and this is a perfect location for the federal government to acknowledge the human rights that it has enshrined in its own legislation by not fighting against unhoused people and by recognizing their human rights in all aspects. Number two, we call on the federal government to provide funding and services to offset the impact that's felt by municipalities in addressing the housing crisis and the existence of encampments. In our view, there are short-term options such as investments in modular housing and much needed longer-term investments in social and affordable housing. And this is urgent and necessary and needs to be accelerated in order for people who are living in encampments to have suitable housing that they can go to. In addition, we call on the adaptation of existing Government of Canada programs such as Reaching Home and the Rapid Housing Initiative to provide these options. And we also call on the federal government to require all recipients of federal funds to adopt a rights-based framework in the enactment and enforcement of bylaws, policies, and other frameworks as already exists in other spheres such as the receipt of healthcare funding. Number three, the participation of people living in encampments is needed to properly design and implement policies, programs, and practices that affect them. Caitlin has already spoken about this in detail, but the takeaway here is that there is knowledge that unhoused people have, and that knowledge must find its way into the programs and policies that are determined. Number four, there must be a recognition of the distinct rights of Indigenous peoples. So in our view, encampments in Canada are linked to the historic and ongoing colonial practices that harm Indigenous peoples and that contribute to housing inequities. And this includes broken treaty promises, dispossession of land, residential school, and chronic underfunding of housing and social services for Indigenous communities. And we see that there are higher rates of homelessness amongst Indigenous peoples across Canada. This is appalling and is contrary to the adoption of UNDRIP that, at least in the BC context, all three governments have enacted and that the federal government has enacted too. So the approach to encampments that is being taken fails to honor these obligations and to address the rights of Indigenous encampment residents. And the Government of Canada must address this. It is also bound by the Constitution and by other obligations to ensure that Indigenous peoples are engaged, that their laws are engaged when contemplating how to address human rights. Number 5, and finally, and then hopefully there'll be time for plenty of questions, a rights-based approach requires access to basic services such as clean water, sanitation facilities, electricity, and heat. So while people are living in encampments, they must have their basic needs met. They must have services that are going to recognize their health and safety concerns. And these health and safety concerns should not be dismantled by government actors, which is happening again all across the country. And so in our view, the Canadian government must, number 1, acknowledge that these services are needed for people in encampments, and number 2, must enable these services to exist in order to recognize the human rights and dignity of people who are unhoused. So I'm going to end there, and I'll pass it back to Sue-Ann.
Thanks so much, Alex. I'm going to stop the share screen now so we can see a few more faces. And I'm going to invite co-researchers here, panelists, if there's a couple questions in the question answer, QAR. So I'm going to ask you to we have about 15 minutes. We could try and take on 2 or 3 questions, but I kind of want to ask you all if there's some questions that you want to speak to, that you want to try to answer, or any other thoughts that you might have from your presentations that you didn't have time, maybe, because everybody only had 10 minutes, which wasn't a lot of time. So if there's anything you want to kind of add, or in conjunction with maybe a question here. Do I have any takers here? We can go one by one, but I see 7 questions.
Can I propose something, Sue-Ann?
Yes.
I'm wondering if perhaps Alex and Esther, I see a number of questions that are asking essentially, like, how do we hold municipalities accountable for their human rights obligations in light of, any number of bylaws or kind of practices and policies? And I'm not a lawyer, but I know you folks are kind of steeped in this, and I'm wondering if you might be willing to speak to it. Or Joe, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on this. Kim, I know you've been doing activism in this area.
I'm happy to take a first. I'm just looking, sorry for the delay. I was just looking at the questions now. A big part of Esther and my research focuses on how local governments are looking at public space. Are they looking at it through the lens of private owners, or are they looking at space through the lens of a government that represents all citizens who live in the city, including unhoused people? And in our view, that shifts the way in which municipalities are going to enforce bylaws, the way that they're going to, if they have power over policing, the way that they're going to direct police. And so, adopting a lens that municipalities have human rights obligations because they are governments and because they represent unhoused people too is one direct way that things will change, in our view, that it will shift which bylaws are enforced. Cities can decide not to enforce a bylaw if they feel that it isn't appropriate. And so they can make that decision, and they do make that decision. How many of us jaywalk, for example, and don't get caught? So even though it's contrary in most municipal bylaws. So there are mechanisms that municipalities can adopt if they also understand themselves as human rights actors. Esther, I don't know if you have anything to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, that captured a lot of what we've been working on beautifully. I think, part of what's really challenging is that there isn't a lot of legal infrastructure for the enforcement of human rights at the local level. And so that's something that I think the federal government and the advocate can really help us think about building out. So it is a fact that these obligations from other levels of government and international law do bind municipal governments, but what we need is more commitment and infrastructure and tools to really make it feasible to do that kind of enforcement. It's not enough to rely on fundraising and the willingness of people in incredibly vulnerable positions to bring actions in our courts. We actually need other levels of government to take responsibility for ensuring that human rights obligations are being fulfilled by all actors. And the federal government has a particular obligation. They do not have the luxury of saying, you know, oh, well, that's a different level of government. They in international law have those obligations to ensure that other levels of government do their jobs in accordance with what they've committed to.
Yeah, and just to add to Alex's point, I mean, municipal governments and bylaw services have the choice not to do things, not to enforce particular sections of bylaws, not to have particular enforcement programs, and that's really important. There tends to be a knee-jerk reaction, particularly in BC, because of housing being provincial responsibility, that the only tools that municipalities have are through bylaws, and they have to use them in some sort of way to be seen active on an issue. And I think, you know, there has to be a way of talking about these issues with municipal leaders and with mayors and saying it's important not what you're doing, but what you consciously decide not to do for human rights reasons. The second point, I'm just addressing one of the earlier questions in there. It has to do with a bottom-up or top-down approach. You know, the greatest resource that municipalities have on this issue are encampment residents themselves, not municipal bylaws, not policing strategies, and that requires sincere and sometimes courageous commitment by municipal leaders to build relationships with encampment residents and street-involved people. And, you know, I think it's given the stigma and the historic views we have around unhoused people, I think municipal leaders really have to be, really have to be pressured into the position that that's the correct thing to do. It's a legitimate response. It's for the public good, and this is the best way that the issue locally is going to be solved over a period of time.
Kim, did you want to add anything before we move on to another question? No, it's okay.
I really appreciate Joe jumping in. I feel like a lot of the questions that people brought up from the downtown east side, I feel like we need help from legal people to answer that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. And actually on that note, I see a few questions in the chat around the federal housing advocate's role. Marie-Josée, I think you're still with us. I don't know if you wanted to maybe take some of those. Specifically, there was a question from people on the downtown east side and the federal housing advocate's role. You know, how does it work? How can people reach out to you? I'm going to read it exactly. What is the best way to engage the federal housing advocate and to make use of this research in responding to evictions, which are taking place right now in Hastings, Tent City, in the downtown east side of Vancouver? So I don't know if a question for you would be good if you're there.
I am here. Wow. Well, I wasn't sure about answering questions today, but I can say, you know, our direct engagement tool is really through our submission tool, but it's not going to be immediate action. And, you know, and that's really the unfortunate part of all of this is we can't intervene right away. We've done things like we wrote letters to, you know, mayors. We are in contact with mayors through certain means. We want to do it through official, you know, large channels, but on the other hand, you know, I don't have the power to kind of intervene on an individual basis, but we do need to hear from you, and what you do submit to us, you know, it is an incredible voice and it adds to the weight, but it won't have the immediate results, and that's the part that keeps me up at night, I have to say.
And I apologize if I put you on the spot a little bit on that one. But I think sees every opportunity for the research that we've done in the context of this project to have impact too, and to know how people can use it, can mobilize it. Are there other questions that you panelists would like to attempt to answer? There's been some questions about municipal bylaws. It keeps coming back, and how to deal with that. There's also a question more specifically about Indigenous people, and are any efforts being made to work with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments, or at least be informed of their interests, research, and infrastructure that they are developing of their own accord, and ensure they're part of the research, policymaking, and meaningful participants. So there's a lot of really, different kinds of questions, different levels too of impact, and I'm not sure if panelists you'd like to, I see Kim has his hand up, would like to try to answer. Yes, Kim, over to you.
I'm just going to try and touch on and maybe inspire others to follow or add to. It seems like the answer to this police state that does not often listen to the municipal, or like as in Vancouver, they're in a pretty harsh situation where the people who just got voted in are supporting this police state. It seems like historically the only solution has been that community organize, so that we have to use this information that you all worked on to organize and mobilize and go out on, like, in groups. It just seems it's the only solution, and maybe others can speak to that, like, you know, like because that's what we're dealing with. Is it's like a war, and people's lives are just trying to be lived, and people are trying to bring dignity to it, and there they are, the police and the bylaw. You've seen the video, so it's very intense.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, that's it in the chat. There's the different levels. There's the oppression people are experiencing directly. How does human rights law, how can it take precedence over municipal bylaws that are actually being used, and kind of also the soft power around, you know, the stigma associated with also living in an unhoused situation. So I'm really not sure how to take on a last question. If somebody has a last question they want to try to answer, because there's so many different levels of action and emotion in the chat.
I'm happy to offer some thoughts. So, you know, it is dire, and it's a terrible situation for people who are living in encampments, for precariously housed people generally, and for advocates. It's really tough, and some jurisdictions are worse than others, right? Like we see, I of course come at this from the legal lens, and we see that in Ontario, for example, courts have not been an easy route to make inroads on the conditions that people face. However, I just want to offer a more hopeful lens, which is that we have the National Housing Strategy Act. It has rights that are enshrined in it. The housing advocate role has been created. There are ways, and we have examples of this, there are ways to bind provincial and municipal governments who receive federal funding, and that should be done. There are ways to increase funding and tie those to human rights goals. That must be done. There are ways to lobby against inhumane practices at the local level. So many of you out here are doing it right now, and we must continue. We must all continue to do this work, because good things do occur. You know, positive steps can be made. The court cases in Prince George, for example, the judicial review that was brought in Crab Park, there are still more legal arguments to be made. There are still more strategies to be adopted. So don't give up. We have to keep going.
Yeah, and on that note, you know, thanks Alex for coming up with a hopeful kind of conclusion. I think, you know, these aren't just legal battles as well, right? They're also, you know, how we share space in society. Even I think of really the social stigma elements too, being also a non-legal scholar. Those ties, I mean, when people in encampments say that they feel more of a sense of community and solidarity in those spaces, I think we as a society have to question what kind of models housing and offers and supports and services are we offering that people don't feel included in what's being proposed, right? And that it's not corresponding to people's needs and their ways of wanting to live and be together. So I think as much as I feel, like you said, hopeful about some of the recent legal decisions and everything, it's like we can't leave it all on that either. It's like it's really a collective responsibility about changing how we respond. And like Kim mentioning the police repression and not accepting that is okay, you know, even as somebody coming to this who is housed, who lives well, like not accepting that that's okay, that happens in my community. I think that's, you know, anyway, I really, really appreciate that. I see a bunch of hands up all of a sudden. I see Kim, Caitlin, Esther, so we'll try and finish in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Is that okay? Yeah, Kim took his hand down. Okay, Caitlin, Esther.
Yeah, just to briefly say, Charlotte, your question is so incredibly important with respect to what extent work in this area is working in parallel to or in collaboration with Indigenous governments who are looking at the distinct intersections of rights of Indigenous peoples and the rights of folks who are unhoused and living in encampments. I don't have a lot to say other than to say this is incredibly important, and I just want to bring it to the whole group, the need for bridging conversations and bridging advocacy and work in this area is just an area I think we tremendously need to focus on now and be really following Indigenous leadership in terms of how we're thinking about and responding to encampments and understanding the ways in which a vast majority of encampments are on stolen Indigenous land. I think my other colleagues will have other comments on this, but just to say that's incredibly important. And I also wanted to mention, I know there was someone in the chat who also asked about best practices and policies. This is something that the SHIFT is working on, that the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network is currently working on as well. So we can follow up in the weeks to come on kind of what is ongoing, but there is a bunch of work ongoing in this area, but it is a fairly new area in the Canadian context. So just also to say, stay tuned for that. Thanks so much.
Just very briefly reiterating what Caitlin said about the importance of looking at what Indigenous governments are doing, looking at treaty obligations, and this is something that Alex and I are really trying to foreground in the next stages of our work, and specifically in terms of some of the legal structures, but you know, really interested in thinking about collaboration, about the policy and governance aspects. But what I also put my hand up to say is really in terms of changing the way we think about public space and the way that municipalities treat it. I think, you know, legal approaches are important, but enacting it in real life is what is going to change that. And there's so many incredible groups on the ground who have been doing this, and it's been really powerful. And so continuing to do that and to live in and treat public space as a public common resource and a place where everyone belongs is the way we're going to change that.
Thank you, Esther. Kim, last word, and also to tell people that the links have been put in the chat if you want to look up the research reports. There'll be more things coming out as well, but for today, we put in some links there for you to be able to access. Yeah. Kim, you get the last word.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, it's a positive, although some might feel kind of harsh, but people have spoken about right to sleep actions. Right to sleep actions. One of the biggest cause of mental health breakdowns, one of the top 3 is the lack of sleep, and the police state apparatus are moving people around and keeping them awake and kind of feeding into that. It's quite horrible, actually. So, you know, having right to sleep actions with, you don't need any more than 10 people who are willing to risk arrest. It seems that and so people, there's a team right now in our community of young academics waiting for the call, but we're really, really struggling. We need a tent, we need this, but it's happening. People are willing to do that. And I want people to know that because it's hopeful. And so it's hopeful to get together with your community and you know, direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience, Martin Luther King, et cetera, et cetera. There's a history there. So I encourage people And it feels like you all will help, and we need the support.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the wonderful strategy, and thanks everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon or rest of your morning. And the recording will be available on the CAMUS website soon-ish. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues, panelists. Bye.